Do you know that 90% of all the teams that win, if they're ahead by 14 or 17 points, win the game? If they're ahead going into halftime because they've padded the lead in the second quarter, 90% of those games are won because they went in by 14 or 17 points. These are where a lot of people fumble the ball too, and they have a lot of problems in life. This is the greatest quarter of your life. Maybe I can't do much while I'm here, but one thing I can do is leave something behind.
That's right.
And let me leave something behind that's positive.
Right.
So church, no matter where you are, whether you're in your first quarter, whether you're in your second quarter, whether you're in your third quarter, or whether you're in your fourth quarter, guess what? Life's a great thing if you know how to fight through every quarter.
Indeed.
And we don't love the enemy that created the fall. We must resist the devil and he will flee from us. But he also said a time to war and a time to peace. How many of you know you're in a spiritual battle for your life? And it doesn't matter what age you are in that battle. And so Pastor Mike wrote this and gave it to me on Friday because he does my PowerPoints for me. And it's every season for football, there's a time to pass and there's a time to run. There's a time to attack and a time to defend. Anybody know anything about football out there? There's a time to kick and a time to refrain from kicking. I think this was a Niners problem. They kicked too many field goals. Sorry. Oh. Time to blitz and a time to score. Time to leap and a time to drive. A time to play and a time to heal. Can you give the Lord a praise clap in this house if you believe that? So let's take this, and I mean it's not really humorous what I have to say, but I do think life needs to have seasons. In fact, I don't think it has to have seasons, but it must have seasons. In fact, there's a season for everything in our life. And the Bible realizes that and covers every bit of that. But let's begin to look at this, if I may, really quickly. The first season in our life begins when we're about from birth to 19. I call these the influential years. These are the years, and let me just kind of relate it to football. How many of you know that you make a lot of mistakes when you're a kid? Anybody out there? In fact, make a lot of mistakes as adults. But as kids, you really haven't matured enough to make solid decisions. And the first few years of your life, first 5-6 years of your life, you're learning to walk, you have your diaper changed, everything's provided. Then how many of you know you go into what we would call kind of adolescence, maybe 5 to 12, and still things are being ordered around. Then you come into your teen years. How many of you know your teen years are the most influential years of your life? You're under so much pressure. It's called peer pressure. And how many of you know that we don't realize, I know a number of teens are in here today, but how many of you know, reflect back. Some of us, that was a long time ago. But how many of you know I can still reflect back to remember what it was like? But I want to tell you this. Listen to me, teenagers, young adults. You may fumble the ball, but it's early enough in the game to still be a winner. Think about last time the Niners played the Seahawks. They fumbled the ball on the very first play of the game, but came back to win the game. We need to understand and we need to know where these kids are right now. We need to be praying for these kids. All of us went through this stage in our life. And really, sadly enough, this is when, in fact, one book I read basically says this, that your personality is formed from about 5 to 12. And for girls, if something sexually was misdone to you wrongly, you have a hard time overcoming that. For boys, if you were mistreated or beaten or slapped, that affected your entire life. even to this day, unless you've let God deliver you from that. But it forms pretty much who we are in those adolescent years. And some people can never break out of those adolescent years because many things happen to them that were done in a bad and wrong way. But how many of you know you have a God, though the ball was fumbled, though you maybe got wounded or you got hurt, how many of you know you have your whole life laying ahead of you? Don't waste it on your adolescent years of the bad things that happened to you. Can I get an amen in this house?
Amen. Praise God.
See, it's like the first quarter. You're really in the first quarter of your life, and you might make mistakes, but how many of you know the game isn't over yet?
That's right.
We got to begin to understand that these years are very influential years in our life. And like I said, much of our personality is even developed at this time. But how many of you know God can come into our life and change things completely?
Amen.
And what these kids are dealing with today are even nothing like most of us dealt with. The drugs, the sex, the problem that's out there, the promiscuity, all the problems of life today. It seems like it's getting younger and younger to where kids are being influenced in the wrong ways of our life. And yet, we have 30, 40 of them set in our services, and they're not here because of camp, but a lot of them. But these kids need our prayers. These kids need an encouraging word. These kids need a smile every now and then. Come on, are you out there, church? How many of you know it takes a community to touch a child? And whether you realize that this is the time when I believe Jesus gives us a promise in life. Raise up a child when they were young, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. How many of us, or how many of you have a wayward child? God's made you a promise. You might not see it tomorrow, but don't give up on that kid. Don't give up because maybe they had a rough teen years, and maybe now they're in the second quarter of their life, and they're trying to figure out life, and things aren't looking good. But don't give up on them in the name of Jesus, because it's like a teammate giving up on everybody else on the field just because they get behind. Are you out there this morning? And so it really is. This is the first quarter of our life, and things happen. In fact, I put down childhood, a time to learn, a time to grow, a time to have fun. You know, sometimes I wonder if kids really know how to have fun. How many of you know we need to take them and let them have fun? Pastor Sandy had one of our grandkids yesterday, and she took her to the park. She's not even 2, but she kept... How many of you know, can you remember the time when all you needed was a little slide? She must have climbed up and down that slide and slid down 24 times. I would have got bored. Anybody know what I'm talking about? But it doesn't take much to, really allow kids. So remember that. Then there's the junior years and the high school years, even the starting college. There's so much pressure at this time in their lives. I don't think we really remember our own lives sometimes, how much pressure there was at that time. How we all wanted to be accepted, and we wanted to be among the kids that we felt were our peers, and we wanted them to love them. But how many of you know kids can be cruel? Kids can be misunderstood, and sadly enough, many people carry that into their adult life because they weren't accepted. Ephesians says that God has made us accepted in the beloved. Amen. Just look at your neighbor and say, I'm accepted whether I feel like it or not. Just tell them that. Number 2, there's the second quarter of our life. Now, I want to tell you, everybody look at me. This is probably the most important quarter of all the game. 90% of games are won in the second quarter, not in the second half. Do you know that 90% of all the teams that win, if they're ahead by 14 or 17 points, win the game? If they're ahead going into halftime, because they've padded the lead in the second quarter, 90% of those games are won because they went in by 14 or 17 points. These are where a lot of people fumble the ball too, and they have a lot of problems in life. And what happens in these adolescent years, it's actually from about 20 to 45. This is a time of marriage, family, and career. Yet how many of you know you're really setting up the next 2 quarters if you really understand this time of your life? Now what I put down is this. Number 1, there's marriage. How many of you know that this is usually the time that people get married, and now you have somebody else and you don't have just yourself to think about? How many of you know things always change when you get married? I have people say, well, they never did this before we got married. Anybody ever say that? Come on, I mean, be honest. I mean, you know, how many of you know we always have our best foot forward when we're on our honeymoon or dating? That's why they call it dating. But how many of you know this is the quarters of your life literally that will set you up for life if you know what to do with them? If you know how to play the game, and if you will, you haven't, I don't think, arrived at really great knowledge, but what you've done is the jitters are out of life and you're no longer a kid, and now there's different responsibilities that come with that. And how many of you know that we set ourselves up to be winners or losers in the second quarter? In fact, in marriage, I always tell, in fact, I'm actually counseling a couple right now that's going to get married in June, and I tell them there's 4 things they always need to remember. Communicate, 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 and communicate. Because how many of you know most marriages fail because people don't communicate, they argue. What they do is they wait till they get in a problem, then they want to communicate through yelling at each other. How many of you know that's not communication? I mean, what happens is, what Sandy and I have done, and what I learned at this part of my life, this is when I got born again. And I know the difference between playing in the game with God or playing in the game without God. Right. And how many of you know without that third person, without those coaches on the sidelines, you don't get very far, even though you have great talent. This is the time really when quarterbacks are made or not made. Because how many of you know they realize all of a sudden it's became a team sport? There's somebody else involved. Every quarterback that's been great, or almost every quarterback that's been great, always understood one thing. Many of them even talk about taking their offensive line out to dinner or lunch once a month or once a week, because they know they couldn't be the quarterback without that offensive line in front of them. Come on, church, are you out there? Amen. See, there's other people on a team sport. How many of you know this is when we need to learn that we're no longer individuals, but we're team players? Because now we brought another person into our life. We've brought someone in that can help and edify and build up. So we need to understand. We also need to understand we need to plan. This is when planning, working together, and family is important. But number 2, it's also something that we don't understand. Now family comes along. How many of you know that kids make a difference in our life? I mean, I've said before, but it's so true. Sandy and I, before Shelley was born, you know, we didn't have any children for 3 years after we were married. And, you know, we could say, hey, we're going to go to the coast this weekend. And we could just throw a few things in the little bag and off we could go, you know, a backpack. And we could take enough to, of course, you know, we didn't have Pastor Sandy's makeup then as much. I'm only teasing her, sorry. Whoops. I love you, honey. Yeah. But when Shelley came along, I actually wasn't here when Shelley was born. I was in Vietnam, and I didn't see Shelley until she was 3 months old. And poor Pastor Sandy, I don't think she got any sleep the first couple of nights I was home, because back in those days we rented just a little duplex, and she had a bassinet at the end of our bed where she laid Shelley at night. And the whole time, if Shelley moved at night, is she okay? Is she okay? Because how many of you know I had not been around babies in my entire life. And here I'm holding my own baby, 3 months old. But it did bring in now, and when we said, let's go to the coast, how many of you know it took bottles, diapers, bassinets? Come on, church, anybody know what I'm talking about? This is a quarter in our life, really, when we learn about responsibility. That not only life is important for a mate, but it's also important for our children. And we're not in this life just for ourselves, but we're here to sow into somebody else. And that person is a part of you. It's your lineage. It's what Jesus calls for us being grafted in or born again. That child was born through the love you have for your mate. Good preaching. Are you out there this morning? And what you have to understand is this is a time of challenge. It's a real time, because people forget many times, sadly enough, about themselves, and they throw their whole life into their children. And it's tragic what can happen out of that. It's also a family, you know, it's a time of in-laws, other families. You know, I tease Pastor Sandy's mom all the time. I said, I bought you a chair. I have it at my house, but Pastor Sandy won't let me plug it in. Because I love to tease her. Because, I mean, I've known her since I was 16 years old. But how many of you know, coming from my family and coming from their family, everything was kind of different. I mean, she started school and ended school in the same place, in grammar school. And I went to 8 or 9 schools by the time I was in the 8th grade. Her mom and dad stayed in one place. I had moved my whole adolescent years, and coming into a family like that, how many of you know it was a blessing for me? But they were still, you know, they did things different, things like eating different. And I know they'll probably listen to this, but it's funny because there was 6 in her family and 6 in my family, counting our parents. And when they would cook, her mom would cook 1 chicken for 6 people. My mom would cook 3 chickens for 6 people. Anybody know what I'm talking about? In fact, they would invite me to dinner quite often. I'd go over there and eat, and then I'd stop by the A&W on the way home. It's a true story. But, I mean, how many of you know there is an adjustment there? It's a time in your life that you realize family is important, but it's not just your family. How many of you know if you marry a person, you marry their family? I mean, it's the power of the good and the bad. It's the power of the good and the ugly. Maybe that family wasn't as structured as you want, but that's what you chose. Because poor Sandy, she put up with my family because she realized she married. And I'll tell you, her parents, if it's anything I've learned, her parents and my parents had enough smarts, though they were different backgrounds, to not get involved with our marriage. They just loved us no matter what. My family with her and even her family with me. And it made something happen in my life. And particularly, like I said, this was the time when God came into my life. And we also have members of other families. Now you have their siblings. And all of these things are happening in the second quarter. But it's not new. You're just now coming into maturity. Are you getting anything out of this? Yes. Because you need to see life the way it really is. It runs in cycles. The Bible tells us there's a season for everything in our life. And then really we come to what I call probably career and jobs and handling money. How many of you know the earlier you learn to handle money, the better it is for you? Come on, church. This is when you should learn to handle money. This is when you should learn to have a career. You love life and things are going good, but we forget about a few things during this time. And then we come to halftime. How many of you know halftime is kind of when we look back at the 2 quarters and we go in the locker room, and I kind of like to call this how do I say this? The time of change. You learn what works and what doesn't work. The coach draws up some new plays. How many of you know it's nice to have the first and second quarter, but you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over and thinking you're going to get different results. And a lot of times you're not smart enough in the second quarter to understand that. But at halftime, you go in and you see some new plays and you've decided what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And this is almost when I call this, and please forgive me, but it's when women go through the midlife, if you will, where everything physically is beginning to change, and men go through a midlife crisis. And if you wear a chain and all that, it's cool, you know, and if you start dressing with bell bottoms and all this, you know, at 45 to 50, it's cool. But how many of you know that this is a time when you're maybe changing, but you're not changing in the right way? Because really you evaluate life, you know, you've got enough now under your belt, you've had a few failures and successes, and yet you're analyzing for the second half of your life what you want. Can I tell you, this is the third quarter. When you go into the third quarter, because what you've talked about at halftime, I can say this can either be the most victorious time of your life or it can be the most damaging. Because in the third quarter, what's beginning to happen is the kids are moving out. And now all of a sudden you're back with just 2 of you in the house. And how many of you know, many people don't know how to make that transition. Because they haven't lived their life for each other, They've lived their life for everything else. Baseball, football, studies, school things, these kind of things. How many of you know it's very easy to come to that time in your life and you're having a cup of coffee on Saturday across from the table with your mate and you're literally thinking in your mind, who are you? I don't even know you anymore. Because for 25 years we haven't spent any time together. Hello, are you out there? How many of you know you can't afford to go through that? It's no time to let down whether you're ahead or behind in the game. It's time to be creative. It's time to speak to one another and begin to understand that you're going to spend the rest of your life now with this person. You're going to have, but the blessing of that is, man, there's new things on the horizon. There's new plays to implement into the game. You no longer, in your love that you have for one another, have to lock all the doors because the kids are at home. It's time when you can once again throw a few things in the car and off you can go for the weekend. Anybody know what I'm talking about in here? I mean, you all know me. I preach where we live. And this is the third quarter of our life. But how many of you know it can be a blessing or a curse? Because you can either get to know each other. And what I love about it, it's so beautiful because all things become new again. It's almost like going back to the honeymoon time. But some people see it going back the other way. I've been with this person this long. I've been with them that long. I don't know. There's nothing new about this. Nothing's ever going to change. How many of you know those are words that destroy the third quarter? You forgot about what you talked about at halftime. You finally made your mind up, I'm going to stick it out with this person and I'm going to go through it with this person. And no matter what the enemy brings against us, greater is He who is in us and He who is in the world. It can be the best time of your life if you will let it be. But it can also be where you just get your tail kicked by the devil. And the opposing team takes advantage because now the enemy's recognized how easy it is to influence you. Hallelujah? And so, you know, it's not like you just learned some things. The opposing team has learned some things. But this is a great time. Kids are getting out of the house. Now you have grandkids. I said earlier, and it's so true, you know, I think it's our job to spoil our grandkids and send them home. I couldn't do that with my kids. If I spoiled them, I had to put up with that. Anybody know what I'm talking about in here? So you had to discipline in a different way, and you had to direct, because now you're dealing with your children as adults, but you still have your grandchildren. What a beautiful time in our life. What a time, really, in my opinion. The third quarter produces as much in our life, I think, as the other two quarters put together, if we know what to do with the time we have. Because how many of you know, normally most men finally calm down because, you know, or women, they're career-oriented, and either they've arrived at their career and they love where they're at, or they didn't get there and they're finally saying, you know, I guess that wasn't just what God had for me. God's got something else. This is when really we can be as more productive at this time in our life than ever before. In fact, do you know the most productive years of your life are from the age of 45 to 65? They say they're the most productive because you finally got away from adolescence and the arguing, and you finally settled some things in life about marriage and money. And how many of you know it can be the most blessed time? Come on, shout me down here.
Amen. Amen. Especially with Christ.
Because if you put, yes, you're exactly right. If you put God there and you allow God and listen to those coaches at halftime, how many of you know you go out and have one great quarter no matter whether you're behind or ahead?
Praise God.
And so this is a great time in our life. This is such a blessed time in our life. Because we're really now, we kind of got away from adolescence completely and away from immaturity, and we've learned a few things. We haven't arrived yet, but we can really deal with things. We've learned to hopefully handle money and deal with our problems, and finding out it's better to be happy than to argue. You know what I mean? I mean, or like one man said, you know, do you want happiness or do you want to be right? You know, most people, they want to be right. I'm right, and that's the way it is. Well, do you want happy? Don't always worry about being right. You know, is it really that important? God says this can be the greatest time of our life. And then lastly, are you out there? Amen. because I love this time. I'm entering this time of my life right now. It's about the time probably in our mid to late 60s, early 70s. And it's when most people retire. But what happens sometimes with retirement is it's a mindset to quit. It's like, well, I give up. Life's beat me all these years. How many of you, this is no time, this is what I wrote down. This is no time to pull back, but to give family, grandkids, and others what we've learned, let us pour it into them.
Amen. That's good preaching right there.
You know, we got kids will listen better than you think. Josh, how many of you were here with Josh preach last week? Josh said something to me about 10 years ago. I've known Josh since he was 2 or 3 years old. And I've seen him grow up and all the things that he's done because I've been around his family, his mom and dad. And what's amazing is he said this to me, and I count that as an honor. He said, there are 3 people I let speak into my life. My dad, my granddad, and you. It's because I've known him. People say, well, kids don't want to hear. Young adults want to hear. Josh will call me constantly about a question. See, I'm coming at a time in my life where I haven't learned everything, but I've learned a few things. And isn't it time for me to take those things I've learned? It's kind of like you recognize that if you're going to win this game, you've been beating up the other side of the team, and it's time to run the ball. They have weaknesses. It's time to help those that can't make it through.
Yeah, that's right.
See, it's a blessed time. Most people give up at this time. They want to just sit down and retire when this can be the greatest thing that can ever happen to you. Find people to pour yourself into. Find people to give something to, because, you know, they want some of that wisdom and knowledge and learn. And kids and even young adults want that sometimes more than we even want to give it. But nobody's doing it anymore. We have 13 grandkids. Do you think Pastor Sandy and I loved staying awake last night? I mean, we like going to bed. But our kids got home from youth camp, and it was great to hear their stories. And how many of you know they'll never forget that?
Yeah, that's right.
As grandparents, don't forget. I remember, and it's not the big things all the time. It's not always how wise you are. It's just sitting down and asking them about school, asking them about something going on in their life. This is some of the greatest times in our life, church. Man, am I getting this out?
Yes.
Because, I mean, you have to understand this is the most... A lot of people say, well, I'm old and nobody wants to listen to me, or I'm retired. That is not true if you desire to pour it out.
Right.
The enemy fools us many times at this time in our life. But it's time to refire in a different way. Maybe you don't have the energy. You know, it's just like what one man said. When I was young, I had the energy to get it done. Now that I'm old, I have the wisdom, but not the energy. Anybody know what I'm talking about in here? But at the same time, you have that wisdom to build on. Hopefully you've learned things through, sadly enough, hard knocks, like a football game. I remember, you know, and give the devil a black eye at this time of your life. Because what you did in your second quarter, it's going to come... I should not even tell you this, but I'm going to say this. When I was playing football in high school, my sophomore year, a kid named Dave Cross got hurt on the varsity team, and I was playing the same position on the junior varsity team. Well, they moved me up, but I only got to play one side of the ball. I only played offense, and I was basically a tailback, and so I would run the ball maybe 5 times, 7 times in a game, but I would block every play. And so I went to Dave Cross. He was a senior. And he had played that position all of his time in sports. And I said, Dave, you know, what do you do to set people up, you know, for later in the game? And this is what he said. He said, Steve, the first play of the game, you take a shot at that guy you're across from.
Yeah, that's right.
And I hate to admit this, but I didn't follow the rules, but every game, and I got a few flags the first play of the game, because what I would do, the first offensive play of the game, I would hit that kid right in the face mask with my hands, just as hard as I could. And I found out if I was going to beat him every game and every play of that game, And you know, this is the time of our life where we're setting things up in life, church. You got to hit the devil face on.
Amen.
You can't give him any room. And I'm going to tell you, if you hit him hard enough, he's going to worry about your life. I'm not saying he'll give up. But with high school kids, I know I'm sure it's a lot different than the pros in college. You just make them mad. But in high school, I found at least 50, 60% of the time, that kid feared me every time I was coming toward him. Does anybody know what I'm talking about here? I know that's really not a very good illustration because I was really breaking the rules. But what I wanted to do is I wanted that kid across that line to fear me. And I set that up one of the very first plays of the game. And church, whatever you're doing, you've learned some things. I'm not saying to break the rules. But what I am saying is learn some things in life. It didn't take me long before I understood if I could hit that hard every play, we would have very successful years. And in my high school years, in 4 years of football, we lost 3 games. Because everybody understood. Because I had a coach that literally knew how to coach. He knew how to coach the players and not his playbook. He would change his playbook every year according to the players he had. Most high school coaches don't do that. They have a set of rule books and that's it.
Right.
In fact, Gary might remember, or some of you that, I played for Corning and we literally had a dynasty there for years. And it's because that coach was literally phenomenal. You got the greatest coach in the world called Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. How can he show us such great things? The Word says that we're inspired. See, the world doesn't have that. But you do. Church, some of you, all of us, are in one quarter or another of our life. What are you willing to do with where you are? I think that's a question God would ask today. As you watch a Super Bowl today, I want you to think about all these things. Because it's important to understand every part of our life. But for you that are sort of what I guess you would call in the twilight of your life, the end is closer than the beginning, it's a great time for you. Don't give up. Learn to pour yourself into people. Learn to allow the Spirit of God to use you with young people or anybody that wants you to pour. Look for people to pour your life into. Many of us have grandchildren. I love pouring my life into my grandsons, being there, talking about their situations, just loving on them, just giving them a hug every now and then. When I take them to school, you don't always have to be real serious. About usually once or twice a week, we get to take Shauna and John's kids to school, usually just one day a week. Well, a lot of times I'll take them. And all the time we're going to school, I keep telling them, you can't kiss no boys or girls today. And they're always going, oh, Papa. But find something that's going to make them laugh. They look so forward to going to school. And all I tease them when they get out of the car, I say, I love you and there's nothing you can do about it. Pour yourself into your grandkids, into young people. How many of you know that's part of the problem? We've let this gap come from seniors to youth. But you have a lot in you. Learn to give it out. Amen. This is the greatest quarter of your life. Maybe I can't do much while I'm here, but one thing I can do is leave something behind.
That's right.
Amen.
And let me leave something behind that's positive.
Right.
So church, no matter where you are, whether you're in your first quarter, whether you're in your second quarter, whether you're in your third quarter, or whether you're in your fourth quarter, guess what? Life's a great thing. Amen. If you know how to fight through every quarter.
Indeed.
Because a winning team today is going to be the one that doesn't play 3 quarters, but plays all 4. One way or another, that's how we have to be. So you're in the Super Bowl of your life today, no matter where you are. Can you say amen in this house? Amen. Come on, give the Lord a praise clap.